Episode 12 of 20, Integrating Standards and Curriculum. I've given you examples of Dixie Elementary as one of our model schools, Southport Elementary, also model school. Both are Title I elementaries. Dixie Elementary was at a D as far as their state test scoring. Then they moved to an A using project-based learning in just 2 years. Southport Elementary actually had a really good state testing score when they started moving to PBL. So they were hitting the mark as far as that state score, but they knew that there were some things they wanted their learners to know with this high ELL population. They had a high socioeconomic population as well. They wanted them to have additional employability skills, and they were able to bring those in and keep their state test score up. They actually had the highest growth of any school in the state, which is a super big deal because that means that their A players were growing and their struggling players were also growing. So everybody was growing. And when you look at your school, somewhere in there, you have one of those two issues, if you will, or problems to solve. Like at Dixie Elementary, they were doing a turnaround. They crushed it. They had passionate teachers the whole time. They needed an instructional model that allowed those passionate teachers to do what they do. And Southport Elementary had to maintain their status as a high performing school as far as state test scores while increasing employability skills. Now, they didn't do that with a bunch of fluff PBL, right? That's not what we're advocating for in any way, shape, or form. It's got to be standards based. So that's why this episode is specifically talking about integrating standards and curriculum. I think every administrator can implement a vision of PBL and maintain excellence in learning by integrating standards into every PBL by keeping these three main points in mind. The first point is to provide strategies for weaving standards into project design without stifling creativity. When you provide borders to, let's just say, a canvas for a painter, like you're only going to be on this part of the canvas. It's going to be 2 feet by 3 feet. It's pretty big. Your creativity is in here, though. That's helpful, right? That's a helpful process to know what the borders are, know where you need to be. Now you can go be creative. And that's part of what the 6 steps of PBL does. Like if you get my first book, second book, actually, PBL Simplified, it gives you the 6 steps of PBL. It gives your teachers examples of wins and fails and a place to start, but it gives them that structure that they're going to walk through, and they like that. And now they can be creative. So as you're weaving the standards in, you want to make sure that there's still some room for creativity. Where this gets a little tricky is when you have a scope and sequence that's maybe dictated by your district. Sometimes you might need to push a little bit and provide some opportunity for some of your teachers to fit their PBL within there. At the same time, your teachers are going to need to fit. Like, let's say that there are common assessments across your grade levels. They still need to be hitting those common assessments too. Like, but could you do it within the quarter? So now they have some flexibility of how they implement that PBL unit. It could be at the beginning of the quarter, the end of the quarter, but they don't have to be lockstep with every grade level. So you've got to figure that out. But what you're trying to do is make sure that we're super standards based and we have creativity to bring in community partners, to have performances, to have an authentic audience come in for your presentations. You're trying to balance those two. And as the administrator who's going to put the final stamp on the schedule or, be talking about what curriculum maps look like, you need to keep that in mind, right? There's a conversation to be had, and it's not the teachers get everything they want. It's not the administrator gets whatever they want. We're trying to find a balance in there somewhere. I know the schedule is tricky sometimes because you've got a counselor and she's the only person that knows how to hit the button. And she says, it has to be this way or it doesn't work. Most of the time, there's a few other ways it could happen. We've just never done it that way. So keep your mind open to that you're trying to weave in the standards and leave room for creativity. That's point number 1. Point number 2 for making sure we're integrating standards and curriculum is to discuss ways to combine multiple subject standards in interdisciplinary projects. You see, the more that teachers can connect their subject matter to the PBL, the stronger the PBL unit becomes. When it starts to veer off of those power standards, that's when it becomes fluff and maybe it's more fun than deep. And what we want our teachers to understand is that as they're gravitating towards their deep, rigorous content knowledge, our PBLs are actually becoming richer, right? It's not the opposite. We don't need to stray away from our power standards. In fact, our power standards are often there for a reason. It's what we want our learners to learn. That is the heart of that content. And sometimes we need to let our teachers know that, hey, this is time for you to go deep into your content because you're going to have new engagement you haven't had before. You're going to have applications that maybe you haven't had before as you're going through the textbook. And now it's time to interweave those subject specific standards into your PBL. And if you can get multiple subject standards, meaning maybe you've got a humanities project, so you've got social studies and English tying in together. Now you have some authentic connections, right? STEM, maybe you've got your science and your math coming together. And the reason those pairings work so well is that your science has content-based standards and math has skills-based standards. So they can weave in together. Science can lead the project and math is going to support. And then your social studies standards are content-based and your English language arts are often skills-based. So again, the content level can guide the PBL unit, the content of it, and language arts can come and build in the skills portion and becomes a really great combination. The third point is to emphasize documentation to demonstrate standards alignment to stakeholders. Teachers don't love this because as they're jumping into PBL, it's like, this is how I've always wanted to teach. I'm free to teach. Finally, I'm unshackled. Yes and no, right? There's still a structure. We've got the 6 steps to give you structure. You also we're still accountable for teaching these standards. So it is absolutely 100% okay to say, well, where are you teaching your power standards? Where can I see them in your PBL units? And their curriculum map might look a little bit different. They might need a little bit of help with this move because now their year might be mapped out in 9 to 11 PBL units, right? If they've really gone all in with PBL, but they should be able to show you where those power standards are. So they might need to be able to move their curriculum map around a little bit or have it look differently, but you should still definitely be able to say, like, hey, show me the documentation. Like, where are your power standards? Where can I find them? Where are you assessing them within a PBL unit? Where are those benchmarks? How will you know that learners have mastery or don't have mastery? Like, how will you reteach that? Where's that going to show up in your workshop? And those are things that our teachers should be able to show. And as you continue to ask for those things, they'll get better at it, right? What you might find, and this isn't, some of it's not a PBL move, right? This is just best practice in a traditional setting too. But we find a lot of times this isn't happening, right? There isn't the transparency. They've checked a box that says that they hit all their power standards, but they don't really know where, or it just happens in the textbook. And again, I'm not blaming anybody. I've been there. Like, I've been that guy. And I didn't know enough about my curriculum map, honestly, to know where my power standards were. Like, yes, I went through the workshops. Yes, I listened to the PD and I checked the boxes. I assumed that we covered them all. Yikes, right? What we find in PBL is that things are so transparent that now it opens up really some deficiencies and some places for help, right? So this could be maybe one of your PDs needs to be around your power standards. If you haven't created power standards as a staff, you definitely need to jump in and do that. And now encourage your staff to create their PBL units around those power standards and make it transparent, make it super visual. And really, even just that step right there tends to increase test scores because now we are intentionally looking at our power standards and we're looking at those things that are assessed in our standardized tests. And we know that those things are good for kids to learn. So we're intentionally putting them in our PBLs. So those are the 3 steps. Dixie Elementary, Southport Elementary, they've gone through these steps. They're just part of their culture. It's not like a have to do. It's just, this is what we do. They provide strategies for weaving standards into project design. So before the project's even launched, we know where the power standards are at, and we know where they're weaved in. We talk about the idea of putting multiple subject standards together. That's the second point, is you're going to put multiple subject standards together to see how they authentically fit together. And the third one is to emphasize the documentation. We should really know where those power standards are being taught and where they're being assessed in each PBL unit. And as you do that, the transparency it ups the ante for everybody, teachers and students, because now the learning is so transparent. You can go in and see before a PBL is even launched where these things are going to be assessed, and you can be assured that standards are in fact being taught and assessed as you're bringing PBL in, and you shouldn't see that dip that some people will talk about. We fight that 100% with transparency and good assessment practices. All right, so your call to action is another podcast. So if you're liking this binge PBL for administrators, you might like the weekly podcast as well, actually bi-weekly, and it's called PBL Simplified Podcast for Administrators. So go to wherever app you're listening to right now and you go to PBL Simplified Podcast for Administrators. You'll see the Magnify Learning logo on there. And this is one where it's completely up to date, right? So when the binge episodes you're listening to are 20 episodes and they're static, right? So you're on 12 right now. We're going to hit the end of this and you're going to be ready to go. But to keep you going, encouraged, inspired, I go on there with solo episodes where I'm talking about the latest need to knows that our network is asking for as far as administrators. And then I'm also going to bring in leadership guests. They might be from education, business, or nonprofit sectors, but it's somebody I'm going to bring in that I think maybe you should know about. So maybe it's social media. Maybe it's how to coach your people up. Maybe it's a community partner. But we're trying to bring you the PBL need to knows that we hear in our design day workshops into the podcast so that you're continually getting PD through our podcast series. So we're bringing in employability skills, amazing opportunities. We are still in a state testing environment, so we're going to have our standards and curriculum interweaved. We've got to be aware of that state score that we get for our schools. It's a real thing. So we're going to have strong content for our learners. We're going to have good processes in place. And we're going to start shifting now. This is our next episode, teacher to facilitator. What's the difference? Can your teachers make the shift without freaking out to go from teacher to facilitator? Check out the next episode to find out how.